Good evening, and thank you for tuning in tonight to the Lessons of Vietnam, telling the real story of the American men and women who fought in Vietnam and their stories. I'm your host, Bill Dixon, Vietnam veteran from 67 68, Tet survivor. We're broadcasting from the international studios of Nissan Communications. And if you want to be part of the show tonight, be sure to come in on Skype or give us a call at 919-518-9773. And tonight, I'd love for you to call in and take part in the show, make comments, suggestions, or whatever. We're going to be talking about a tough subject tonight, the massacre at My Lai that the American soldiers will supposedly have done. You can see there, I'm warning you that there are some rather graphic photos, and if there's a chance that you be offended or upset, probably would not be the best show for you, but I just want to let you know there are some graphic pictures of My Lai and so forth, of dead bodies and children and women and so forth. So not trying to sensationalize on them at all. It's just part of the story, so you'd understand the story. There's never really been a real dispute. There were atrocities going on in Vietnam, as in any war. I mean, you're talking about people going in with the mindset to kill in order to, for a soldier anywhere, you have to dehumanize the enemy to a certain extent. They can't be people, they have to be the bad guys. As we did in Vietnam, the gooks, the dinks. That's what we call the communists. It's hard for a young man who grew up, or a woman for that matter, who grew up here in the United States to just outright kill somebody. We're always taught all through life that killing people was wrong. But at the same time, when you go off the war, it's you're doing your job and the other side are doing their job. And in order to get through it at all, with any sanity at all, you have to dehumanize the people. And in a situation like in Vietnam, you didn't know who the good guys and the bad guys were because they all spoke the same language as far as we were concerned, or sounded like, and they all wore basically the same uniform, the black pajamas and the conical hat. There was actually 320 alleged incidents substantiated by the Army. They investigated a bunch of them, which I'll go into in a minute. And there's no way I'm trying to justify tonight going through this and talking about different things. You can justify My Lai. It was wrong. It shouldn't have happened. Bad leadership, a lot of different things involved, but it should not have happened. It really shouldn't happen anywhere, but it did, and it will again. There's nothing in this program, as I've gotten here, that condones any atrocities at any time, any place. What I'm trying to do tonight is illustrate the basic mindset of the young men in the military, specifically in Vietnam, since the one I know and what we're talking about in the show. Their mindset, what put them in that mindset, why things that happened that shouldn't have happened and so forth got out of hand. Unfortunately, there were atrocities committed. If you've ever seen an Oliver Stone movie, it looks like they were committed almost every hour of the day. And a lot of lesser acts going into villages, maybe mistreating the villagers, trying to get information. But see, the villagers were in a situation that if they helped the communists, the American soldiers would come in and take their food, their rice away from them, burn their hutches. And if the Americans went in and were treated the villagers nice, or villagers treated the Americans nice, then when the Americans left, the communists came in and did the same thing that we were supposed to be doing. It was a terrible situation for civilians in any war. In Vietnam, where many civilians were cooperating with the enemy, the communist NVA, National Vietnam North Vietnamese Army and the VC, two different groups. The North Vietnamese Army were the guys in uniform, communists in uniforms, trained, highly trained, had almost the same kind of equipment we had, sometimes better. And the VC were the guerrillas, as we think about. They were all part of the civilian population. It was very hard to tell the difference. I want to go back and just for a second and give you a personal story. I used to be a builder, and I was building an apartment complex down in Charlotte, and I hired some guys and got to know them, and they were Vietnam vets. This guy was probably at the time, probably in his late 30s, early 40s, something like that, about the time we would be, and his hair was completely white. And I got to talking to him once I found out he was a Vietnam vet. And he had accidentally killed a child while he was in Vietnam. Didn't go into details how, and he destroyed his life. He came home, he and his wife divorced, he had a business, he lost his business, became an alcoholic because he had accidentally, in the middle of a firefight or something, there was a child get killed. Now I saw how it destroyed this man's life for all that time. And then people talk about all the atrocities that happened in Vietnam. It was like it happened because that's what the American soldier did and wanted to do. And it makes me mad sometimes to look at how this man suffered and to look at the people who comment happened so easily and so forth. The overwhelming civilian deaths during the Vietnam War were basically coming in during a battle, doing a strafe and run, a bombing, so forth. There were, as they call it in the TV shows, collateral damage. Either way, they are dead, and it's terrible. A lot of it was accident, but you'd be surprised at the number of Americans that were killed by accident in what they call friendly fire. And there's nothing friendly about friendly fire. But it also sometimes during the bombing of the areas where the villages were, it saved a lot of American troops. During the period of January 1965 to 31 August 1973, there were 241 cases which involved allegations of war crimes by United States Army troops, excluding My Lai. That is, sounds like a whole lot, but you look at 65 to 73, and they investigated 36 cases. Which is kind of brings me up to the next slide. It says 160 of these cases, which there it says 36 cases. You got to watch when you come out for information because sometimes it can throw you off there. 160 of these cases upon investigation were determined to be unsubstantiated. Substantiated allegations of war crime violations committed by Vietnam U.S. personnel were prosecuted. I was at Long Binh. At Long Binh, there was a place there called LBJ. Now, Lyndon Baines Johnson was the president at that time, but LBJ was Long Binh Jail. There was a lot of men in Long Binh Jail that were there because of being prosecuted for things that they did to the Vietnamese community and to other veterans and so forth. Between 1965 and 1973, 201 U.S. soldiers and 77 Marines were convicted of serious crimes against the Vietnamese. Those people ended up, a lot of them, in Long Binh jail. All in all, this is a small number as you compare it to 3 million men and women in Vietnam. While the critics say it's small because the crimes were not prosecuted, the truth is that American soldiers in Vietnam, for the most part, behaved well. I don't know anybody personally, and I know a lot of Vietnam vets who were involved in battle over there, and none of them have ever said anything about killing children. Let's see if we can put it in perspective a little bit. 2.5 million men, U.S. men and women, served in country during the 10 years of the Vietnam War. It was actually more like 26 years if you really count the time we were there. In Detroit, Michigan, here in the good old United States, in 2004 had approximately 1 million in population. Half of the people who went to Vietnam. In 2004, there were 354 murderers, 589 rapes, 6,820 robberies, 13,477 aggravated assaults. Now compare that to the 2.5 million people, or men and women, who served in Vietnam. It gives you the idea that the men and women in Vietnam, most of them served honorably in the best they could. As any place else, there's going to be a few people involved. But was the city of Detroit an atrocity during that period of time? Things hadn't changed a whole lot. Were the people in Detroit labeled baby killers? Vietnam vets were. Or they were called drugged out killers. You come home, you couldn't tell anybody you were a Vietnam vet because they would think you were going to go crazy and start shooting people, or you were on drugs and didn't know what you were doing. Were the people of Detroit considered guilty of these crimes? Was everybody who lived in Detroit considered guilty of these crimes? No. But you turn back around, we came home, we were all labeled as baby killers, drug addicts. We were all lumped into one big pile. Well, you know, even the veterans organizations didn't want us back in because we were all crazy and we lost the war. What is the difference between the time of Vietnam veterans in Vietnam and the city of Detroit? Not just picking on Detroit, the other cities had those problems. Vietnam had its protesters. There's news media looking for stories. Some returning Vietnam veterans who were bitter and who collaborated with non-Vietnam veterans that claimed to have committed atrocities. One such group was the Winter Soldier Group. It was financed by none and only but Jane Fonda. One of the big higher-ups in that group was a man by the name of John Kerry. They came back and told a bunch of lies and so forth. He talked about how he killed women and children, but nobody ever tried him for war crimes. They made him a United States senator. Is that one of the criteria? It was a travesty committed on the men and women who served the country with honor to call all those things. Again, that organization I was just talking about was the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. As I mentioned, funded by Jane Fonda, with John Kerry. They had testified before Congress. Everybody talked about how the passionate speech that John Kerry did, the speech was actually written by one of Robert Kennedy's speechwriters. It wasn't John Kerry's. Some of the people who testified to all the atrocities they committed in Vietnam were not Vietnam vets. The men in charge of that group, Vietnam Veterans Against the War, knew they weren't Vietnam vets, or should have known they weren't Vietnam vets. And some of the Vietnam vets who did testify to atrocities were coerced to do so by the leadership of that group. Now, that's not coming from me, that's coming from some of the people that were there. There's still unverified testimony creating a belief that these things were the case. These people were never investigated of the events. There was no way, because they would not sign an affidavit at all. So there was no way for the government to go back in and investigate these crimes, war crimes that these people purported to do. But between the movie industry and the war protesters and everything else, we were all lumped in that one group as being baby killers. There was a bunch of bigoted presumptions from the news media, the war protesters, and onto the American public. Now, this next picture is a very famous picture. Was this an atrocity? On June 8th, 1972, this picture taken by Associated Press photographer Nick Uck was outside Trang Bang village about 20 miles northwest of Saigon when the South Vietnamese Air Force mistakenly, let me read that again, when the South Vietnamese Air Force mistakenly dropped a load of napalm on the village. As the village Vietnamese photographer took pictures of the carnage, he saw a group of children and soldiers along with a screaming naked girl running up the highway. And he wondered, why didn't she have clothes? Then he realized she had been hit by napalm. He took a lot of water, poured it on her body, and got her to hospital, which saved her life. Even though she was burned on 30 to 40% of her body, they didn't know whether she was going to live or die. If you ever saw the movie, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, if you remember, the American soldiers were also hit by napalm accidentally. That's called friendly fire. It's tragic, but it happens. I guess in its way, it's an atrocity, but it's an accidental thing. It's not something that somebody did on purpose. It was just just terribly tragic accidents, but I guess in its own way, you can call it an atrocity. The young lady did survive thanks to the American hospitals and so forth. She today lives in Toronto, Canada, and travels around the world for the UN speaking on peace and so forth. Now let's talk a little bit about the men and women who went to Vietnam. Let's put them in a little bit in perspective there. Most of the guys going to Vietnam as military, they were not career soldiers. They had the minimal amount of training when they went there. I didn't even get jungle training or Vietnam training. I went through engineering school. From there, they said, we're going to send you to Vietnam. We'll give you specialized training. They had me to Fort Lee, Virginia, gave me an M16 rifle. I shot 2 clips. They said, okay, you're now trained for Vietnam. And the entire time I was in Vietnam, I carried an M14, never got a 16. Most of these young men were 19 to 21 years old. Now, I've heard some of the people in Congress today talking about the 19 to 20-year-old kids are just kids. You can keep them on your, according to Obamacare, parents can keep them on your insurance down to 26. But these were 19, 21-year-old people we were putting over there in charge of other men with weapons to kill people and surrounded by people they didn't understand and so forth. Most knew little about the country they were going to, the culture, and the mind of the population of Vietnamese. The Vietnamese mindset is totally different from the American mindset. It just, everything about it, their culture, how they, what they do, how they do it, how they treat their families and so forth. It's totally different. It wasn't wrong, it was just their way of doing things. For most of these guys, it was their first time in combat. And let me tell you something. When that first bullet crackles over your head, it don't whistle, it crackles. Well, your mind kind of changes right there. Everything in life changes right there when that first bullet goes crackling about your head. Sometimes because of so many lieutenants getting killed. Plus, most of the time they would take a lieutenant, a first lieutenant or second lieutenant, and put him in the field with a group of soldiers. And then after about 6 months, they'd move them back to battalion headquarters or something that to be sitting at a desk or doing paperwork or so forth. And the problem was also they were losing so many lieutenants, they were just about making anybody a lieutenant. You didn't have to be specifically well-trained to be a lieutenant, but they made you one. Now let's talk about another problem we had. The planning of the war in Vietnam, when Kennedy was president, John F. Kennedy, he and the Pentagon did not necessarily get along very well. They kind of screwed him over with the Bay of Pigs, which is another story you should check out. So he hired all this think tank people, like Robert McNamara, the smartest man in the world, and all these people. And they ran the war from a cabinet in the White House. What I mean by that, let's look at these 2 villages here. The planning of who to attack, how to attack, and so forth was all done in Washington, D.C. The rules of engagement, which we talked about before, were all decided in Washington, D.C. Now let's look at the 2 villages here. One's a friendly village, and we know it's a friendly village because somebody in Washington, D.C. who had never been to Vietnam decided that was a friendly village. For whatever reason they got the information from, we're not quite certain, but somebody decided that was a friendly village. The other one is a unfriendly village. That means everybody in that village is liable to shoot you, kill you, poison you, or works for the Viet Cong. The only problem is this designated unfriendly village was whenever you're in the area or you go through there, the people were not overly friendly, but they were just cautious. But they talk to you. Every time you go by, the kids would come out and bring you some cold sliced pineapple, maybe sell you a Coke. It's amazing where they got those cold Cokes from time to time. Maybe they even warn you there's a VC in the area. These people were non-political. They didn't care who was in office. All they wanted to do was to be free, raise their families, their water buffaloes, and take care of their rice. But they treated you okay when you went through. But this village is called an unfriendly village. Why they're unfriendly village, we don't know, because we're there in Vietnam, and they decided in D.C. it was. I know a friend of mine that was a forward observer for artillery. He said there were 2 villages like this, and every day the friendly village, they got mortared. But they really couldn't shoot back, supposedly because Washington said that was a friendly village. And the unfriendly village, as I said here, there was all the kids run out and so forth. Now, this village that was designated as a friendly village was supposed to be a safe place for the American soldiers. But when you went through there, the villagers weren't friendly. Something bad happens. One of you guys steps on a booby trap. A sniper gets them. You're ambushed. You stepped in a punji pit. There's something always going on when you're there. Now, what does that do? It creates fear and frustration towards all villages. How do you know when you're going into a village whether it's a friendly village or an unfriendly village? And you can't depend on what they're saying in Washington that's a friendly village or an unfriendly village, because you've already proven that what they say don't necessarily mean the same in real life. So you're constantly uncertain about the village you're going into, the people you're dealing with, which creates other mindset situations. Now let's talk about another problem, being that we didn't understand their culture, so forth. Let's talk about Freefire Zones. And the majority of Vietnam were Buddhist. Almost in front of every house there was a ancestral stand where they burn incense and so forth. The Buddhists are very ancestor oriented and so forth. But we needed to set up Freefire Zones. Now, how do you set up a Freefire Zone? Well, what we would do, either the South Vietnamese government or the American government would go into the village and say, hey, there's a lot of Viet Cong around here and we want to make sure you're protected. So what we're going to do is we're going to put your entire family, we're going to take your water buffalo, we're going to take your pigs, chickens, goats, everything you got, bags of rice, and we're going to take you 100, 200 miles away from this spot and give you this nice new village. So we move these people. If you ever move to an area that you don't know anybody, it's like moving people who are moving from the north down to the south, or people moving from the south up to the north. You don't know anybody. They talk different. They're speaking English, but Northerners talk strange, if you didn't already know that. But you go up there, they talk different, you don't know anything about it. And another problem is your religion, your Buddhist religion, and you need to go back to be close to your ancestors. So what happens? As soon as the government guys leave, you pack all your stuff up, and this time you walk 100 or 200 miles or whatever it was back to the area that you just came from. But we have a problem. We have a serious problem. What is that problem? Well, as I mentioned, you move to an area, the area that you need to get back to your old village or back in that area of your ancestors and so forth. So the problem with going back is now the government has set that up as a Freefire Zone, which means that it's kind of a no man land, Indian territory, whatever you want to call it. That means anything moving in that area is considered to be Viet Cong. the Americans or either the Americans or the Vietnamese can bomb that area without any problem whatsoever. They can strafe it. They can send patrols out there. Anybody moving is basically considered communist because we moved all the non-communists out of that area. So that's how a lot of villagers got killed that way, is because they went back because our government or the Vietnamese government just kind of overlooked, even though the Vietnamese government, which happened to be Catholic at the time, overlooked the Buddhist and the mindset of they weren't ancestors and so forth. So that created a problem. Now let's talk about another problem, a mindset. The American soldiers fights and dies for a location. Let's just say we're going to take a hill. In the process of taking this hill, we lose a bunch of buddies. We've won the hill. What do? We get back on the helicopter and go back to someplace else. Because of the helicopter, the American soldier saw more combat in 1 year than World War II soldiers saw in the entire duration of the war, due to the helicopter. Now what happens? As soon as we leave that hill, the communists come back into it. Guess what? We got to go back and do it again. We might lose a couple more friends in the process. Why do these friends die? We didn't take territory. In other wars, you could tell how you're winning because you took territory. In Vietnam, you take the hill, lose a couple of buddies. Then a little bit later, you got to come back and take the hill again, maybe lose another couple of buddies. What's the purpose? What did you win?
That happened just in the last few years. What do you mean Vietnam?
Yeah, that's true. And then, to make things even worse, the American strategists decided that particular location is not a strategic location anymore, and takes the American soldiers out and lets the communists come back and take it with no effort at all. Two examples of that was Hamburger Hill and Khe Sanh. 77 days the Marines were under fire at Khe Sanh. When it was all over with, they bulldozed Khe Sanh and left. Why did all those men, those young Marines, die at Khe Sanh? We were just going to turn around, bulldoze it, and leave. What was the purpose? How do you think the men who survived and lost friends felt when they left Khe Sanh and it's not worth it anymore? If it's not worth it now, why was it worth it for those 77 days? That also creates this mindset of the American soldier, frustration, scared, the young men. Now let's talk about another scenario. Now, this one might get some of you worked up. How do you tell the good guys and the bad guys? They ain't a program. As I asked the guy on the bus, how do you tell the good guys and bad guys when I first got to Vietnam? He said, to point a rifle at you, they're probably bad guys. The only problem was you could go into a village or a store and they're friendly and so forth, and that night they come back to blow you up. Quite often the base camps had Vietnamese people, men and women who come in and do the menial chores on the base, and that night they could very well be coming back with explosives on themselves. And even this guy with the rifle there, you couldn't be 100% certain, because even though he's not in uniform, he could be a communist guerrilla, or he could be what we call a rough puff or popular forces. That means some of the South Vietnamese villagers who were given weapons and so forth, and they all dressed alike, they all sounded alike, they all wore those crazy hats. So even then you had to be careful not to shoot him, because he may be a good guy. But then again, he may not be a good guy. What you want to do is call me in at 919-518-9773 and give me your comments and opinions. Or even better, come into computers, and that's 2K as in kilo, voice, VOICE, on Skype.
Or log into the chat.
or log in on the chat, ncbi.org, and give us your read on so forth, and tell me I'm all wrong, or tell me I'm right, or straighten me out, or whatever. Next question is tough question. This is the one I'm trying to get some comments on. How many of you out there in my audience can say right now, unequivocally, you would never shoot a child? That's a hard, tough decision. As I mentioned a while ago, the young Vietnam vet whose hair had turned white became an alcoholic, lost his business, destroyed his life, who accidentally killed a child. How many of you can say that you would never kill a child, or that you would? Let's look at this scenario, and then I'll let you answer that again. We're in a village somewhere in Vietnam. Of course, we're in South Vietnam. Virtually every village in South Vietnam had some form of communist in it. The cadre there may have been a tax collector, he may have been a propaganda person, but every village had one. And they would get up, make speeches and so forth. The answer to the chain of command right on up the line, right on back all the way back into North Vietnam. They're the ones that kind of let the people know that when the communists came in, whether the village had been good to the Americans or not. Now, let's just say right now that I am the communist chief of that village. I'm going to come up to this little girl, and I'm going to tell her, these Americans have been coming through our village every day. What the peace-loving people of North Vietnam, they were always the peace-loving people of North Vietnam, want you to do. When the Americans come through this time, I want you to take this grenade and run up to them and blow them up. Now, of course, in the process, you're going to die. Why should she do this? Kill herself and these Americans. Well, here's why. I'm going to tell her that I'm going to cut that baby that her mother's expecting right out of her belly. I'm going to kill your grandmother. I'm going to cut your father's arm off, and I'm going to take your little brother and cut his leg off. So you're going to help me, or I'm going to do this to your family. She didn't have a whole lot of choice. Her family's going to die, or she's going to die. The Vietnamese love their families, and just like we do. This poor child didn't have a lot of choices. She has to do what she's told. She will die, of course, but her family will live. All she has to do is kill herself and kill these soldiers. This is how the communists fought the war in Vietnam. The life of their own people meant nothing to them, or the only way, just some way they could use them. That's why when we were bombing Hanoi, we told the Swiss that we were going to bomb Hanoi so that the Swiss could in turn let the communists in Hanoi know that we were coming to bomb them. So the idea was they could get the civilians out of town, which they never did because they wanted civilians to get killed so they could use it for propaganda. Now,
ask me why.
Why?
We just passed the 500,000 viewers.
Super.
For the show.
500,000 people been watching the show.
500,009.
Okay. Well, those of you out there, have you decided yet what you're going to do? Now, I'm going to change hats for the story. You're with me. You're my leader. I'm just a lonely private, and you're the officer in charge. I look to you to protect me. You're my officer. I'm going to do what you tell me to do, but it's your job to keep me alive. Don't waste me. Don't just go out and get me killed and waste me. You take care of me. You're hot. You're tired. You're sleepy. You did an ambush last night. You hadn't had a whole lot of sleep. As you're approaching this village, a child starts running towards you. You got to make a decision. You can't run. You're an American squad. You can't turn around and run every time and go to a village and some little girl runs up to you. You can holler, stop, stop, stop. Problem is, she doesn't speak English. And you may not speak Vietnamese. By the way, Vietnamese, dung lai, that means stop. Well, let's just say, even if you did it, she may not stop. She's still running your way. What you going to do? She's getting closer and closer. What are you going to do? As leader of these men, you only have seconds to make a decision. These men are looking to you for them to come home. The child is getting closer. Firing a shot over her head won't work. It may kill someone else in the village. Shooting her in the arm or leg, as I have heard before, that don't work except in the movies. You shoot somebody with an M16 and it rolls over, it's going to probably take her arm or leg off if you can actually shoot her in the arm or leg. There's not many of us were trained that good. And she's running towards you. She's getting so close now. If she does have explosives, you ain't got time to do anything but shoot her. The time to make that decision is now. Now. What are you going to do? Let me ask you. What did you do to save you and your men's life? Did you shoot her? How are you going to live with that decision? You shot her to save your men because that's your job. Did you let her come up and pull the pin on the grenade and kill her and you and your men? It's hard to answer that question if you're dead. Well, let's just say you lived a little bit and answer the question. You, like the child, didn't have a lot of choices. But let's talk this scenario a little bit more. What if you shot her and upon getting closer, you see instead of a grenade, she had fresh pineapple slices to give you and your men to welcome you to her village? How did you know? How would you have known? Was it a grenade? Was it a Coke? Pineapple slices? How did you know? You're 19, 21 years old. You're in a country that you don't know a whole lot about. People trying to kill you. You don't know the people. You don't know the culture. You don't know the language. You're totally out of your depth. And you got to make that decision. Is there a right or wrong decision? I'm not certain. I would guess if you don't shoot and she blows you up, that definitely be considered a wrong decision. A decision. It was a terrible decision to have to put anybody in. But we're talking about young men, 19, 21 years old, who had never been in combat before. Is that atrocity that we even put them in that situation? It's an atrocity that they had to put in that situation and had to make that decision. It's an atrocity. If they shot the young lady and she did have a grenade and blew up, that was the atrocity that she blew up, but that was an atrocity by the communist. Or you shot her and she had pineapple. I mean, just what considers an atrocity. Now let's talk about another problem we had as far as how do you tell whether you're winning or losing in Vietnam. We already discussed you didn't take land. In other wars, you moved from city to city and you took their space. And you pretty much knew what was behind you was yours and safe. Well, in Vietnam, you didn't take land. You were always surrounded by the bad guys. There were no safe places. Even Long Binh that had 55,000 troops, we got mortared, we got rocketed, we got gooks in the wire. Sappers blew up the ammunition dump. There were no safe places. You only hold and you only own where you're standing at the moment. And then you leave, and then the bad guys got it. Well, for somehow or another, somebody came up with a great way to tell whether you were winning and losing. It was called body count. How do you come up with body count? Well, as you can see here, the GIs joke that anything is dead and isn't white is a VC for body count purposes. If you killed a water buffalo, it was a communist VC method of transportation. You didn't know how many people, body counts were turned in for nobody there. At the same time, the Vietnamese communists always policed their sites after a battle to take away the dead, because they knew we were very good about, we controlled everything by body counts. So they would go back in, sneak back in and pull the bodies of their dead friends out and put them in bushes or down in the tunnels so we couldn't find them. Now, it would be hard to believe you've been in a big, heavy battle fight, firefight for a couple of hours, and all of a sudden the communists have pulled out. But you know they're still there somewhere. Some general or colonel or major or whatever back at the base camp says, okay, I want you to go out there and get me a body count. Your guys are tired, they're wounded. They know if they go back out there, they might get shot again. But they had to have a chart keeping up with the body counts. That was a tough way. Now, I never got one of these, but this was supposed to be a card, a pocket card of the 9 rules. And I'm going to take a moment because I don't think you can read it on the screen there. But here are the rules. The Vietnamese have paid a heavy price in suffering for their long fight against communists. We, military men, are in Vietnam now because their government has asked us to help its soldiers and people winning their struggle. The Viet Cong will attempt to turn the Vietnamese people against you. Duh. You can defeat them at every turn by the strength, understanding, and generosity you display with the people. Here are 9 simple rules. Remember, we are guests here. We make no demands and seek no special treatment. 2, join with the people. Understand their life. Use phrases from their language and honor their customs and laws. Let me tell you the problem with that. Vietnamese is a beautiful language to hear, but it's also an inflection. The same sentence, the same words, depending on which way you grunt, can mean 5 or 6 different things. You can either tell somebody that they're the nicest person in the world or they're sorriest SOB in the world just by the way you grunt that sentence. And we're supposed to go in and learn their phrases and so forth. We did. Beaucoup, dinky dow, that's very crazy. Some things like that, which were French and so forth. Treat women with politeness and respect. Treat women with politeness and respect. Since we basically destroyed the Vietnamese economy, so many of the young ladies to support themselves and their families turned to prostitution. And when you went into a village or you went into the town, I mean, it was like you were a magnet. I remember a little kid coming up to me my first time I went into Binh. He couldn't have been more than 5 years old. And his only thing he understood in English was, you boom boom my mother, she's a virgin. But you're supposed to respect the women and be polite, which is hard to do. Make personal friends among the soldiers and common people. That's pretty good if they understand English or you understand Vietnamese, which didn't happen very much. Always give the Vietnamese the right of way. Be alert to security and ready to react with your military skill. Don't attract attention by loud, rude, or unusual behavior. Now, I will tell you that the young soldier in Vietnam was loud, rude, and crude. We had our own language. If you would hear us talk in Vietnam, you would cringe at the words we used and so forth, but it was a bunch of young men together expressing an opinion. Avoid separating yourself from the people by display of wealth or privilege. Now, we had these nice uniforms, we had these nice weapons, we had money to spend because there weren't a whole lot of places to spend it, but you're not supposed to display wealth or privilege. You have a nice bunk. If you're back in a base camp, you have the PXs and post exchanges where you can buy a car be there waiting for you when you get back home. You can buy, almost everybody I know had a reel-to-reel player and a Canon, a Pentax Spotmatic or 35 millimeter camera. But we're not supposed to, okay. Above all else, you are members of the United States military forces on a difficult mission responsible for all your official and personal actions. Reflect honor upon yourself in the United States of America. This was supposed to go to everybody who went to Vietnam. Now let's talk about this one. I'm going to speed it up a little bit. This is how you handle the enemy. Disarm your prisoner. Immediately search him thoroughly. It's pretty important. Require him to be silent. Nothing wrong with that. Segregate him from other prisoners. Sometimes there's more of them than there are you. Guard him carefully. Take him to the place designated by your commander. Now that's fairly easy to do. But you cannot and must not mistreat your prisoner. You put a bag over his head and tie his hands behind him. And is that mistreating? Humiliate or degrade him. Okay, we won't go there. Take any of his personal effects that do not have significant military value. If it's written in Vietnamese, how do you know it's a personal diary or it's the plans for the attack? Refuse him medical treatment if required and available. Those are things you can't do. Now, let's just go on the next step. Running up short on time here. Handle him firmly but promptly but humanely. Take the captive quickly to security. Mistreat of any captivity is a criminal offense. Every soldier is personally responsible for the enemy in his hands. If you ever see how the South Vietnamese treated prisoners, you would also cringe of their own people. You treat the sick and wounded captives the best you can. I don't know of any time that a wounded or sick prisoner basically didn't get the medic and didn't look after them. All persons in your hands, whether suspects, civilians, or combat captives, must be protected against violence, insults, curiosity, and reprisal of any kind. Those are big rules to have to follow. Now let's talk about one of the biggest atrocities that everybody knows about. The village of My Lai. The whole area was called Pinkville. You can see there, My Lai was just right outside of Da Nang and Hue. Quite a good distance from Saigon. It was right there by the edge, but close to the ocean and so forth. I just kind of gave you where an idea was. My Lai is kind of confusing. There were several villages right there together. That's the one that made all the news and so forth. The My Lai Massacre. The worst case of an American war crime was the massacre at My Lai on 16 March 1968 in the aftermath of Tet Offensive. The village and surrounding areas were assaulted to clear Viet Cong known to be operating in the area. A company of soldiers from the Marical Division, following ill-defined orders and rules of engagement, murdered 400 to 500 Vietnamese civilians. I mean, just slaughtered them. The court-martial transcripts are sickening to read as they include the indiscriminate execution of men, women, and babies, ensured along with sexual assault and other brutality perpetuated on the victims, individually and in groups. A second massacre of 90 to 100 civilians occurred in the neighboring hamlet of Calley at the same time. Now, this is one of the famous pictures of the civilians at My Lai. When the report was sent back in, the body count report was sent back in, it was said that we had a victory. We killed 128 enemy combatants, okay? Which goes back to if it was not white and it were American soldier, it was a VC. After reports of atrocities were filed by military witnesses and informal investigation amounted to a cover-up. They only found that a small number of civilian deaths had occurred, but those had been unavoidable. This is a man and his son laying alongside the road. The investigating officer stated the allegation that U.S. forces shot and killed 500 civilians is obviously a Viet Cong propaganda move to discredit the United States in the eyes of the Vietnamese people. That's what the news came out to start with. Nothing further was done until after 2nd of April 1969 when a soldier witness mailed a letter detailing the My Lai massacre to 30 prominent people in Washington, D.C. President Nixon, Secretary of Defense, Chairman of Atrocities, senators and congressmen. Most people ignored those letters. But finally, a congressman and the media latched on to stories. You see there's a picture here of this woman, women there. If you notice the woman in the back with the baby, she's just putting her blouse back on where she was sexually assaulted before this picture was taken. And shortly after this picture was taken, they were shot. The media latched onto the story and a public firestorm began as the United States was subjected to worldwide criticism. On 24th November 1969, the Secretary of the Army ordered an independent inquiry into the massacre that eventually brought all the facts to life. The Vietnamese woman and children in My Lai before the killing of in the massacre. According to court testimony, they were killed seconds after the photo was taken. I just mentioned. These despicable acts were done by average American boys in a normal unit. What explanation can there be? Several factors were suggested by the investigators. Command responsibility, inexperienced leadership, ambiguous orders, lack of control during the operation. Yes, I would say all those things had something to do with it, which we'll get into a little bit farther down as far as the ambiguous orders, inexperienced leadership of Calley, lack of control, because he completely lost control. The callous and fear developed from the experience of cruelty and deviousness of the hands of the enemy combatants or civilians cooperating with them. In other words, we learned a lot of the callousness of war from the enemy. Dehumanizing the Vietnamese people by racial attitudes. They're Vietnamese. They're not as good as us. There were gooks. There were dinks. The things we had to dehumanize them to survive ourselves. Misplaced objectives due to body count as a success metric. All these things contributed to the My Lai massacre, but it still doesn't condone it. It still shouldn't have happened. Now let's talk about how we got up to this point. Charlie Company came to Vietnam in December 1967. They basically came as a group, which was unusual. It located in Quang Nai Province in June 1968 as one of 3 companies in Task Force Barker, an ad hoc unit headed by Lieutenant Colonel Frank Barker, Jr. Its mission was to pressure the VC in the area and get them out. Charlie Company's commanding officer was Ernest Medina, a 33-year-old Mexican-American from New Mexico who was popular with his soldiers. One of his platoon leaders was 24-year-old William Calley. Charlie Company's soldiers were expressed amazement that Calley was thought by anyone to be an officer material. One described Calley as a kid trying to play war. Calley's utter lack of respect for the indigenous people, the Vietnamese, was apparent to all in the company. Now, they already didn't respect him on how is he going to lead them. The next is a picture of Colonel Ernest Medina, who's the commanding officer. Now, on March 14th, a small squad from C Company ran into a booby trap, killing a popular sergeant, blinding one GI and wounding several others. The following evening, when a funeral service was held for the killed sergeant, soldiers had revenge on their mind. After the service, Captain Medina got all of his men together and gave them a pep talk. He tells them that the VC's crack 48th Battalion was in the vicinity of a hamlet known as My Lai 4. This is not just the Viet Cong. This is the NVA, the training guys. The soldiers' mission was to engage the 48th Battalion and to destroy the village of My Lai by 7 a.m. Medina said that women and children would be out of the hamlet and all that could expect to encounter would be the enemy. The soldiers were to explode brick homes, set fire to thatch homes, shoot the livestock, poison the wells, and destroy the enemy. The 75 or so American soldiers would be supported by the assault by helicopter gunships. Now, this is what they went into that village being told. Medina later said his objective that night was to fire them up, the American soldiers, and to get them ready to go in there. I did not give any instructions to what to do with the women and children. Although some soldiers agreed with that recollection of Medina's, others clearly thought they had ordered them to kill every person in My Lai. Perhaps his orders were intentionally vague. What seems likely is that Medina intentionally gave the impression that everyone in My Lai would be their enemy. At 8 a.m., Calley's platoon had crossed the plaza of the town's southern edge and into the village. They encountered families cooking rice in front of their homes. The men began their usual search and destroy task of pulling people from homes, interrogating them, and searching for the VC. Soon the killing began. The first victim was a man stabbed in the back with a bayonet. Then a middle-aged man was picked up and thrown down a well, and a grenade lobbed in after him. A group of 15 to 20 mostly older women were gathered around a temple, kneeling and praying. They were all executed with shots in the back of the head. 80 or so villagers were taken from their homes and herded to the plaza area. As many cried, "No VC, no VC." They were trying to say that they were not VC. Calley told soldier Paul Meadlow, "You know what I want you to do with them?" When Calley returned 10 minutes later and found the Vietnamese still gathered in the plaza, he said to Meadlow, "Haven't you got rid of them yet? I want them dead. Waste them." Meadlow, with tears running out of his eyes, and Calley began firing at the group from a distance of 10 to 15 feet. The few that survived did so because they were covered by the bodies of those less fortunate. There's Lieutenant William Calley, the platoon leader, who nobody really thought he should be an officer. But the helicopters that were covering him, an Army helicopter pilot by Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, got there about 9 a.m. He noticed dead and dying civilians all over the villages. Thompson repeatedly saw young boys and girls being shot at point-blank range. He became furious at what he saw and reported the wanton killings to brigade headquarters. Then he became almost frantic because headquarters didn't do a whole lot. He saw bodies in a ditch, including a few people who were still alive. He landed his helicopter and told Calley to hold his men there while he evacuated the civilians. One account reports that Thompson told his helicopter crew chief, or door gunner, up on the Americans if they fired at the civilians. Now that, I can't imagine the thoughts that went through that door gunner's mind when he was told to shoot the Americans. Thompson later said he didn't remember giving that order. He put himself between Calley's men and the Vietnamese. When the rescue helicopter landed, Thompson had 9 civilians, including 5 children, flown to a nearby Army hospital. Later, he went back himself and rescued a baby still clinging to her dead mother. Hugh Thompson remained in combat and then returned to the United States to train helicopter pilots. When the revelation about My Lai surfaced, he testified before Congress in military inquiry and the court-martialed Lieutenant William Calley, the platoon leader at My Lai, who was the only soldier to be convicted in the massacre. When Mr. Thompson returned home, it seemed to him that he was viewed as the guilty party. He was the bad guy. I received death threats over the phone, he told CBS News program 60 Minutes in 2004. Dead, mutilated animals on my porch some mornings when I got up. So I was not a good guy. When he died, he was still a bitter man for his treatment, for where he was for stopping the massacre at My Lai. Now, I'm going to stop the show there. I still had a bunch more to go, but I'm going to stop the show there. Our next show, we may end up having a 3-part show out of this before it's all over with. But our next show will be April 26th, and we'll carry on from what we've done tonight, and then we'll start the new point from there. But there's quite a few more pages there. So I hope I gave you something to thought, and let me know whether you shot the little girl or didn't shoot the little girl. It's a tough decision to have to make. By the way, the first Saturday in the month where we do our normal ceremony, May 6th, we'll be doing the ceremony at the Vietnam Memorial. We're also celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Vietnam Memorial. The actual day it was dedicated will be Memorial Day. So if you're in the Raleigh area, either May 6th or Memorial Day, stop by the Vietnam Memorial. We'll be doing a ceremony there, commemorating the 30th anniversary of the wall. And again, thank you for tuning in. Looking forward to you coming back next show, and we're looking for our next 500,000 people. So go out and tell all your friends about us, and see if we can't go ahead and make it the next 500,000 a little faster. Thank y'all, and good night.
You're tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section on nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Atomos.com, makers of quality video recorders and converters, CarolinaApparel.com, and DeltaForce.net.